All right, so can somebody give me kind of a working definition of standing to sue? What do you think it means? Okay, grounds to sue on. What would that mean? If I didn't have grounds, I wouldn't have reason, I wouldn't have the ability. Yeah, let me give you another example. Let's say that Australians came in right now and grabbed, I don't know, John Paul's backpack and started digging through it. You know, no reasonable suspicion, no reason at all. He just was on a mission, just felt like, I don't know, something was off, and so he went through. Is that a constitutional search? No, it's not, and we all saw it. I maybe even took out my camera and started videoing this clearly unconstitutional search. But you know, John Paul's kind of a little quiet, and he doesn't like to make waves, and maybe he wants to be a police officer when he, you know, graduates. He doesn't want to make Officer Alanis mad, and they didn't find anything anyway. You know, like there was no reason to search his bag, so he didn't get like hurt, or you know, he didn't get anything bad happen. So John Paul decides not to file suit. He decides not to sue Officer Alanis for violation of his Fourth Amendment rights. Is that wrong? I mean, it's kind of wrong. Like, shouldn't Officer Alanis face justice for a clear violation of John Paul's constitutional rights? Sure, he should. Does that mean that if John Paul refuses to sue, that I can sue because I watched it all happen? I have the evidence on video. I'm going to sue Officer Alanis for an unjust search? No, because I don't have standing. So what is standing? Involvement, right? So standing to sue is going to be some way to prove that you have been directly harmed as a result of the action that was taken. I can't just say like, well, I'm concerned about my other students and that Officer Alanis might violate somebody else's rights, or like, it really upsets me to know that the Constitution isn't being upheld at A&M Consolidated High School. Those things do not give me standing to sue. I don't have a right to not be sad or not be a little concerned. The only person who has standing to sue in that case would be John Paul. So in this case, the state of Washington is trying to prove that it has standing to sue. So what are some of the arguments that it made to say that it has standing to sue? Okay, their economy was impacted. They have lots of businesses in Washington that do international business, that have international workers, something like that. Okay, what else? What are some of the other direct harms they're claiming? Yeah, so workers, I'm going to put that under business impacts. Yeah, this is an important one. The state universities. The reason this is so important is because the state universities are technically part of the state government, right? Like Texas A&M University, like the professors who work at A&M, they are officially state employees, right? They work for the state of Texas, not like the university is part of the state of Texas. Does that make sense? This is important because it is less clear if like a state can claim harms on behalf of their like businesses that work there. But it is definitely clear that if the state university is hurt, the state of Washington itself is hurt, right? The state university is part of the state itself. So the state universities have problems with like professors and students who can't come. Anything else claimed as harms? Yes, I think that business impacts workers, taxes. They also talk about their residents in general, that just people who live in Washington are negatively affected. That like Washington state citizens might have family in these countries who have approved visas but are not allowed to come, and that makes them sad or whatever. Now, here's the thing. If I don't have standing to sue, like the case of me with John Paul and Officer Alanis, if I do sue anyway, is the court going to hear my case? No, they're going to throw it out. So here's why we're spending all this time talking about standing to sue. Standing is one of the biggest parts of the Trump administration's arguments in this case. The number one thing that the Trump administration is arguing is that Washington does not have standing to sue. Why not? Who are the people primarily impacted by the executive order? Who? Foreign people. People who are not in the U.S., right? Like, by definition, in fact, the only people who are directly impacted by the order are people who are not in the U.S., right? Either refugees applying to come here, or people who are not U.S. citizens or green card holders who are traveling and want to come here, right? Like, by definition, the only people directly impacted by this executive order are people who are not in the U.S. So Trump's administration is arguing that in this case, the state of Washington has no standing to sue. The state of Washington has not experienced any direct harms. People might have experienced some direct harms, but they're not part of the state of Washington. They are not in Washington by definition of this ruling, right? And here's why that's important. If the Trump administration is successful at proving that Washington has no standing to sue, well then, what will happen? Well, sure, but remember, I'm thinking bigger picture. You're right on the TRO, but bigger picture, the executive order will be upheld. Like, what if the district court, here in a couple of weeks when they finally hold the hearings, what if the district court rules that the executive order is unconstitutional? They decide this is not a constitutional order. But then the Trump administration appeals to the which courts? Appeals to the circuit court, and the circuit court, remember, can the circuit court hear questions of fact? So the circuit court cannot consider whether or not it's constitutional. The circuit court can only hear questions of law or procedure. So if the circuit court reviews and says, you know, I don't really think Washington had standing to sue, then even if the district court ruled that it was unconstitutional, what will happen to the executive order? Will it be allowed or not? It will be allowed. I'll repeat that because it got confusing. If the district court says it's not constitutional, but Trump appeals to the circuit court and they say that there was no standing to sue, then what will happen? What will happen to this district order that said it was unconstitutional? It will fall. It will go away, right? And so now all of a sudden the executive order will be allowed to be enforced, even if the district court said it was unconstitutional. Because the answer is, the very first thing, like number one, before, oh, I don't want to do that. Number one, before anything else happens, a court has to establish that the plaintiff has standing to sue. And if they have no standing to sue, like even if Australians 100% violated John Paul's rights, if I have no standing to sue, even if I can prove there was a violation of rights, nothing, the case will be dropped. It cannot be heard. The courts can only hear cases from people with standing to sue. That's why this is such an important part of the Trump administration's claim. Because they're arguing that the courts shouldn't even consider, they also have other arguments. Let's be clear, they have other arguments. They argue that in fact it is constitutional, and they provide evidence as to why they think so. But their first thing that they're going to hammer home is that there is no standing to sue. And to be fair, there are some reasonable explanations of that. Like, can the state of Washington claim standing based on travel, based on people who aren't in the U.S.? Well, maybe, maybe not. So that's standing to sue. Any questions about that? Okay, so I just used the word plaintiff. And we have, you might have read the words defendants. So can you tell me, what do those words mean? That's right, the plaintiff is the person who is suing. I always think of that word plaint as kind of like part of the word complaint. The plaintiff is the person who is bringing the complaint. They think something is wrong. In this case, who is the plaintiff? The state of Washington. Officially, it's Washington et al., meaning Washington and the other states involved, including, in this case, Minnesota. Okay, and then who is the defendant? Well, in this case, so right, the person is the Trump administration. Again, officially, it's Trump et al. But so the defendant is the person, yeah, defending, the person being sued, the person who is accused of wrongdoing. And they have to defend themselves. Every single time a court case is identified, it is always identified in this order: plaintiff versus defendant. So what about Mapp versus Ohio? Mapp, right? Valerie Mapp, she was the one who was making the complaint. She was the one who sued because she thought that Ohio had done what? Unlawfully searched her, right? That they had broken the law. And then Ohio was the defendant. They were the ones trying to defend the action, trying to say that this was okay or this evidence should be admitted because blah, blah, blah. So Plaintiff versus defendant, always in that order. The plaintiff brings the suit. The defendant is the one trying to defend or trying to make that go away or trying to explain it away. Any questions about that vocabulary? Okay. So what I want us to do next is turn to pages 5 and 6. Again, page numbers 5 and 6. I really encourage you to actually read through all of the brief, not just the parts that we individually focus on. We're focusing on the parts that are really important, but I think it's kind of cool to get through the whole thing. And if you'll just decide to be really interested, there's a lot of really cool niche arguments going on here. So I encourage you to read it all. But we're going to kind of skip page 5. This first part here, it says A, the defendant's appeal is procedurally improper. Officially, the law says that a temporary restraining order cannot be appealed, but the argument made by the Trump administration, which we're going to get to on Wednesday, is that although it was called a temporary restraining order, that it was actually something called an injunction, which is a more permanent stop. Anyway, that's just a whole bunch of jargon, It's not that important to the ultimate decision of the case. So that's why we're kind of skipping that part. That's what they're talking about, is that the state of Washington in this case is trying to argue that this is in fact a TRO, not an injunction, and therefore it can't be appealed, that this appeal itself is invalid. But anyway, we're going to move on to part B, where the state of Washington is trying to show that there's no grounds for the circuit court to hear this appeal, that the appeal should be thrown out. And the reason is that there are these 4 criteria, but let me sort of explain kind of in a different way. The Supreme Court, or the President Trump, is asking for something called a stay. But a stay is just effectively a TRO of the TRO, right? So a stay is, all a stay would say is, we're not going to enforce the TRO. And all the TRO says is, we're not going to enforce the executive order, right? So you see that effectively what they're asking for is a TRO of the TRO. They want to restrain the TRO from being in effect. Does that make sense to you, kind of, sort of? Yeah? Yes, the law is weird. So effectively what they're asking for is a TRO of the TRO. So what this is saying is if the court deems this order reviewable, defendants, who's the defendant? Trump bears the heavy burden of showing, and there's this list of 1 through 4. And we're going to go over them because this list of 1 through 4 is the same list of things that the state of Washington, who are they? They're not the defendants, they're the plaintiffs. They're the same 4 things the state of Washington had to prove to get the TRO in the first place, right? So in order to get a TRO, or in this case a stay, which is just a TRO of a TRO, you must prove 4 things. And they're listed there. And so what I want you to do is take just a minute at your tables and read those 4 things, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and see if you can put them in plain English. What the heck does that mean? 1, 2, 3, and 4. Feel free to talk at your table right there on page 6. You'll see them numbered out underneath letter B. What are those 4 things?